Welcome to this edition of the Wispy Mop Music Acoustic Radio Podcast Series. I'm your host, Todd Middle Initial C. Walker. Yes, that's right, it's me. And sitting next to me is someone I have known for a long, long time. Disregard the gray hair on my head. You don't have a whole lot of gray hair on your head, Doug. But Doug Whynott went to high school with me, and probably junior high, too. I don't remember if we did or not. I think we did.
Oh, we did. Yeah, we did.
John Simpkins, which is now, what, a condominium or something like that?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think people are living there now.
But he was the first place in the state meet in Massachusetts for javelin throwing. He was also a runner and a basketball player and an all-around good guy, and he played a practical joke on me in high school with a bunch of other guys that embarrassed me totally because I should have known better. And I'm not going to tell you folks the story. I'll remind him about it later. But this is Douglas Whynott. He is, among other things, a blues boogie-woogie type piano player. He's a published author. Where do we put that book, Doug?
Here it is.
There's one of his books, which is about the tuna fishing in the Gulf of Maine and around Cape Cod, Massachusetts. He's also done one on the maple syrup industry called Sugar Season. And he's doing one, and that's the reason for the podcast today, is about who?
A man named Sammy Price, who was a jazz musician and noted blues player within the jazz idiom, and also known as the King of Boogie-Woogie, because he was playing boogie-woogie astoundingly well during a classical era when boogie-woogie was a national phenomenon and kind of a craze, and because he played at a club in New York called Cafe Society, where it was the first integrated nightclub in New York, and the best black talent in the city played there. And he was one of the boogie-woogie men there. There were several, but he was one of the guys who played boogie-woogie, often on a bill with the great jazz pianist, one of the greatest, or some people say the greatest jazz pianist ever, Art Tatum. He was blind, and Sammy would be playing on the same bill with him and would sit at the piano with him and tell Tatum who was in the room. It was a great time in his life, and he became very well known. He was a celebrity pianist in New York at that time. And I met him when he was in his late 70s and 80s at the Copley Plaza Hotel in Boston. I brought him to the University of Massachusetts in Amherst for an arts residency. And after that, I began studying piano with him. I studied with him for 3 years, and we were close up until the time he died in 1992.
So, go back in time. Did you play piano as a kid and I just didn't know?
Well, no, I didn't play piano as a kid, but I played organ at home. My mother played jazz organ, and she was pretty serious about it. She would perform at parties sometimes. She never really played out, but she practiced sometimes 3, 4, 5 hours per day.
That much?
Yeah, and she just played jazz. She didn't play anything else. And she had a good teacher at Gott's Music Store in West Yarmouth. His name was Dick Gavoni. And all these jazz books showed up at our house when I was about 10 years old, and then on through high school. And her goal was to play the music that she danced to on the military bases on Cape Cod during the World War II years and after. And specifically, the song she wanted to play was Duke Ellington's Satin Doll. And she did, and she played it well. And she was kind of an inspiration to me. I played on the organ. I didn't take lessons because I was so involved in sports, and she told me that when I asked about taking lessons. But I was interested in blues-oriented music and would use some of her books to pick out riffs. I remember one was simply, and I would play it over and over and over, and I got so I could make a rhythm out of it. And my father one time grabbed my little sister and danced on the living room carpet when I was playing that song. So that's how it started. And then I followed her example later on when I taught myself how to play the piano and also how to tune pianos.
Well, tell the story about learning to tune a piano, because you relate that, and folks, his book is not published yet on Sammy Price, but Doug was wonderful. He sent me an advance copy of the first third, I guess, or
Yeah,
quarter.
first 100 pages.
And it is fascinating in itself about Sammy Price. But tell everybody, or tell me so everybody can understand, how you learned how to tune pianos.
Well, I went to college for a few years, couple of years, and then I decided to do a reset because I didn't feel I was getting quite what I wanted. I wasn't sure what it was I wanted, and I had to figure that out. So I took some time off, and I worked, had various jobs. And then I came upon the idea of becoming a piano tuner. I read something in the Whole Earth catalog about it. And I had a great uncle, my father's uncle, who was a professional pianist, and he had told me that piano tuning was a lost art. So I thought, well, if it's a lost art, maybe I can claim it and become a piano tuner. So I holed up in a cottage in East Ham during a winter, and I spent 4 hours every morning studying piano tuning and 4 hours in the afternoon studying playing, kind of following my mother's example. And after 6 months of that, I moved out to Amherst to go to the University of Massachusetts to finish my education. And I became a tuner out there. There was a generation of piano tuners that were lost in that the older generation was retiring, 2 generations before me, and the one in between just was not there. So I stepped into a lot of work. And after 3 years, I became the concert piano tuner at the New Fine Arts Center Concert Hall at the University of Mass in Amherst, and that's how I paid for my education. So I continued to tune pianos through my BA and then through my MFA in English and creative writing, after which, when I began teaching, I stopped and retired from piano tuning. So it was a great 15 years. I met a lot of people. I was on concert halls meeting some incredible people, and I met Sammy Price indirectly through my tuning work when he was playing in Boston. Now, there was a collection, a series of sheet music that came out in 1942 during that era at Cafe Society, a nightclub, called the Leeds Boogie-Woogie series. And they were transcriptions by several of the great pianists who played there at Cafe Society. Their names were Pete Johnson, Albert Ammons, Meade Lux Lewis, Mary Lou Williams. They had brought in by the famous record producer named John Hammond.
Oh, yes.
Who became a president of Columbia Records. Well, he was the music director of Cafe Society. He had also hosted a famous concert, historic concert at Carnegie Hall called From Spirituals to Swing. The purpose was to bring black music into New York. And he brought 3 boogie-woogie pianists. They all got on the stage together at the same time and played on 3 pianos. So that led to the Cafe Society becoming the boogie-woogie piano place in New York, and Sammy Price played there after a couple of years. He was one of the people whose music was transcribed for the Leeds Boogie-Woogie series, and I had gotten copies of that through one of my piano tuning customers. I didn't know anything about him. I didn't have his recordings. I had recordings of the others. But then I learned that he was playing in Boston at the Copley Plaza Hotel in '82. And so I went in to hear him play, and it was just such a memorable night hearing him play authentic blues and boogie-woogie piano in among playing jazz standards. He knew them all. And I just kept going back, and I kept going back. He would play a month on and a month off. And just about every time that he came to the Copley Plaza, I went in and listened to him. And eventually I got to know him. He did a residency at Harvard. He had put on workshops and a concert. So he told me about that as his gig was coming to an end after 4 years. And I said, why don't you come to the University of Massachusetts where I was teaching? And so I brought him there and sponsored an arts residency for him in Black History Month in 1987. And after that, he said, that was wonderful. We've got to come back here. What can I do for you? And I said, give me piano lessons. And he said, well, I don't teach piano. I don't give piano lessons, he said, but I'll show you a few things. So I started going down to Harlem, where he lived, and going to his house, going to his home, his apartment, and taking lessons on his piano.
So what were some of the first things he showed you? He wasn't teaching you, but what were some of the first things he showed you? Play it on the piano for me.
The first thing he showed me was a turnaround, which comes at the ends of blues courses. Blues music is structured usually in a 12-bar format, and at the end of the 12 bars, as you're moving into the 12th bar, sometimes there's what's called a turnaround, which indicates to you whether or not they're going to play another 12 bars or whether it's going to end. So he said, this is what I want to show you. And that's the only thing that particular day at the first lesson he said about that. And other times when we began, he'd say, I want to show you something else. But he showed me a turnaround which went like this. Whoops, sorry. Was that? And with that chord, you know it's going to go again onto the next chorus. So it's like this. I'll play it an octave higher. And he had me play that over and over. In the evening, so it was like that. It was that figure, and that he insisted I learn, and so I did that. And now, you can play it in other keys, and if you listen to the blues, you can see that very often it's a presence, that turnaround. So I thought it was really interesting that that's what he would show me first of all, that little piece, and then he said, "Play a slow blues." And I fumbled around and played a slow blues. And then he played a slow blues, and my jaw dropped. Of course, I had heard him play it at the Copley, but when I was standing at the piano right here, and he was playing it, and he said, "I'm putting this down so you can learn it." And I thought, I'll never be able to learn that. Because he was playing tenths. In his left hand, he was playing this. Now you try to reach that, it's... I can do it like that, but I can't do it to time. I mean, I have at times, but anyway, I looked at that and I thought, I'm never going to be able to play like that. But I adapted a different bass. I usually use... So I could play what he was playing on the right hand, sort of. So I could play some of the stuff in the right hand by using a simpler bass. And that day he taught me how to play several songs up above my head. He taught me a figure that he would play, an interlude figure that was so beautiful for When the Saints Go Marching In was kind of his theme song. He would end every performance, almost every performance, with that song. He was from that era when The Saints Go Marching In was a very, very popular song. And so we began to learn that music, and I continued to bring up those tunes throughout the 3 years of the lessons, and sometimes to play other tunes.
So how often did you take lessons from him? Was it something like you did it every month or every 6 months or whenever he was available? How did you do that?
Well, it was sort of like whenever he was available, but also it was periodic because I would go down there with questions about what I wanted. But I'd go down there and I'd schedule a lesson and we'd go over some of the things we had done before. And then I'd say, like there was one lesson I remember writing about, which was he had played a concert at UMass that was recorded, and there was one little piece from it. It was the introduction to Route 66, mm-hmm. which he played for a singer who liked to sing that tune. And I listened to it, and I took just that piece down to Harlem and showed it to him. And this was after working on a few other things. And he said, He said, "What is that?" He said, "I've got to learn that." He didn't even remember how he had played that. And he sat down, he said, "Oh, well, what's in key is it in? It's in B flat. Is that it?" I'd say, "Well, yeah, that's it." But he was playing it to a rhythm, he was going. And he'd play it different every time. And the singer would be rapping. His name was Doc Pittman, and he was sort of known as, he was an Ink Spot, one of the old vocal groups, but he was sort of a rapper. He would talk his way through a song often, and he would talk about what he called his travels in the show world. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been on some of the greatest stages, and I've heard Lena Horne and Duke Ellington." He'd go like that, and Sammy would be going, "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been all the travels, done all these travels in the show world. Been on some of the finest stages you could imagine." Like that, sort of. I actually started playing the tune, but so he taught me that one time. It was just such a memorable lesson, and there, just to go a little further with that, he came to a point in the lesson when I said, "Well, when you go from the 1 to the 4, meaning the tonic chord up to the subdominant chord, from the B flat to the E flat," but I said, "When you go to the 1 to the 4, and he's saying, "I don't know what you're talking about, 1s and 4s." He said, "Listen, if you get into the 1s and 4s, Doug, you're not going to get this." He said, "I'd have to go by my natural ability. If I thought in 1s and 4s, I'd have to go by my natural ability and then remember 1 and 4, and you'd get off the track doing that." He said, "You got to drop one of those things. Let that go." And I thought, well, that's something that's important to think about, To play by feeling, then you have to drop some of that technical thing that's going on in your head and play by ability or play by memory. Or play, what you know.
So were you playing up until you met him looking at sheet music, or were you playing by ear?
I was playing both ways. I had that Boogie-Woogie series, so I learned a few tunes from that. I learned one in E flat, Jimmy Yancey's State Street Special, which was his masterpiece. And some of the Albert Ammons. That bass I played a bass that I learned from Albert Ammons that went. He was a great, great player.
It's Snoopy.
Yeah.
Yeah, Peanuts.
Some of Sammy. Yeah, and I tried to learn Sammy's, but it was too complex. I had to learn the recordings. But anyway, I started by looking at sheet music, and then when I got to Amherst, they had good record stores, and I was able to collect some albums, and I would learn from albums, listening to the albums, and then just listening to them over and over. I began to play in a blues band, and I began to get solo piano gigs where I was just playing blues piano because I just kept learning one song after another. And sometimes, there was some sheet music that would kind of show you the basic figures of some tunes.
Now, did you study music theory at all?
I took one music theory class in college, and I didn't have any piano lessons except 1 or 2 individual lessons here and there by different people. I didn't really take piano lessons. I'm self-taught in that way, but I used my mother's books too. I went by what I learned with Mrs. Council's middle school class, EGBDF, every good boy does fine, FACE. I took that down to Eastham and then transposed it over to the written notes and then started doing that. And I owe Mrs. Council a great debt for her music classes. That wasn't the only thing that she did. There was some wonderful things. And one thing she did for me that's too long to go into, but I'm very grateful to Mrs. Council. So yeah, I learned that way and started playing by ear. And I got into a blues band with a very good blues guitarist who gave us mixtapes. And we would just start playing those, and I'd have to figure it out and go along with him. We had a really good band going for a while.
Well, on that note, we're going to take a short commercial break. We're going to be right back, so you stay right there. And why don't you give us a little something on the piano to go into commercial?
Okay.
Just about 10 seconds. There you go. Welcome back. We're here with Douglas Whynott telling us about Sammy Price learning how to play his style of piano, boogie-woogie blues, or blues boogie-woogie, however you... What's the best way to say that?
Well, boogie-woogie is a form of the blues.
Okay.
It's a fast, danceable form of the blues. It's usually instrumental. But there were various artists who put words to it to make some really romping rock and roll type songs. As a matter of fact, boogie-woogie is a precursor of rock and roll music.
Well, I was going to say, because many of the things you have played, like the turnaround,
Yeah.
you listen to any of the music from the 50s through the 60s, and you hear that, and it's somewhat disguised sometimes, but when you were playing, I went, oh, I know what that is.
Yeah.
Now, you played the version where you're going to go around again. How do you play that turnaround if you're telling everybody this is the last time?
You would play the root chord instead of the dominant fifth.
I gotcha.
So you go. And then you'd play.
Gotcha.
We're done. Or, again, however you wanted to play that dominant chord, that D in the G, it would say, we're going to play another.
So when did you discover that you had the ability to write, or that you had the dream of writing?
I was fairly young. Of course, I had great reading experiences, that were important. But one thing that sort of directed me was that my uncle, the uncle I described, who was a jazz musician himself at one time, up until the Depression, and then he started a jewelry store in Boston. He collected National Geographics, and at one point, when he was moving to another house, he gave me his collection, and it was decades that went way, way back, like from the 20s to the 50s or that sort of thing. So, and I looked at them, and inside the masthead, it said, "Generous remuneration made for articles accepted." So I thought, wow, people actually go out into the world, all over the world, and hang out with interesting people, and they get paid for this. I'd like to do that. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there was that part of me, the practical part, living on Cape Cod and being close to the ocean, that said I want to major in marine biology. And I had these dual aspirations of becoming a marine biologist and coming back here, and then, or becoming a writer. And that's what really caused me to step back and say, I need to figure this out. So I got a job at Sealand putting on dolphin shows and talking to school kids about marine life. But that was enough for me, plus the fact that science courses were really hard for me, and math courses were even harder. So I didn't think that was going to be feasible. But I thought, well, I'll study anthropology a little bit. I took some anthropology courses because that's what National Geographic was about. But that still wasn't the way to become a writer. It would be a helpful way. But eventually I said, well, I'm going to go to UMass and study journalism. So I did. I studied journalism and English. They were joint majors. And that's how I made the next step. And of course, the final step was when I said to one of my journalism professors who taught article writing, which I saw, that was the course I needed to take. That was very, very transitional for me. I said, how do I become successful at this? He said, go through an MFA program and study fiction. That way you'll learn about narrative, character development, point of view, more about style. And so I said, okay, here I go. So as a person who didn't write fiction, I took a couple of fiction workshops as an undergrad, though I can't say I didn't write it, but that wasn't my goal. I went into a fiction program and wrote short stories, but also started my first book because one summer in graduate school, I worked for the state of Massachusetts Department of Agriculture as an apiary inspector. I was keeping bees at the time. And so I met someone who had 4,000 beehives that he transported to Florida for the winter. And that became my topic for my first book. So I was writing short stories and the first couple chapters of my book, and that became my master's thesis, MFA thesis. And from there I went on to finish the book, and it was published.
Now, did you continue to write short stories, or was that it?
That was it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wrote one that was published in the alumni magazine for the University of Massachusetts. But I kept on getting ideas and assignments for nonfiction books. And once I wrote the first one, then it was, okay, what am I going to do next? And that's when I got into Giant Bluefin. You know, this one of the editors, the editor who published the paperback version of my first book about beekeepers called Following the Bloom, wanted to work with me on a topic. So we searched and searched around. We couldn't find a topic that worked. But I came upon a newspaper story that said that the bluefin tuna fishery was perhaps threatened by overfishing. And I investigated it. I had a friend who I went to high school with, Nelson Shiflett, who introduced me to a bluefin tuna fisherman in Barnstable, and I wrote a book proposal. And the editor I worked with was along with me, and the book proposal went into an auction when several publishers bid, and she was way outbid. And I got a contract with the best literary publisher in New York for that book.
Wow.
Farrar, Straus and Giroux, who told me it was the best piece of reportage that had come to that publisher for many years, many a moon or something like that. And so I ended up having this great publisher for that book about the bluefin tuna fishery, and it got this wonderful, wonderful review in the New York Times. I just got really lucky with a reviewer who understood that I was writing about the fish, but I was also writing about the conservation, but I was also writing about the fishermen who were people who I knew growing up, and who my grandfather praised fishermen. It was a noble profession. It wasn't, a villainous use of resources. It was something that was very hard to be, and people who made it were regarded as really accomplished people. So the book is dedicated to my grandfather and to my daughters. And so that's how I got to that point.
Well, you have a very unique style of writing, or way of writing. I don't know how the proper way to say that is. That I feel like I'm along for the ride, but I'm invisible. But I'm actually part of what's going on.
I really like what he has to say about Maverick.
And I've read Sugar Season. I'm into the bluefin, and I've read the first section of Sammy Price biography. I guess you'd call it a biography, although there's a lot of you in it too. So I would.
Yeah, I call it narrative nonfiction.
Okay.
A hybrid form in the sense that it's both memoir and biography and history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it's just the way you write, and each one of the three, and I am going to purchase the one on beekeeping, is each one is different, but there's a constant through all of them. That it's almost like if you're listening to music and the drummer hits the hi-hat or something and you get a spike. You've got the constant, but then you've got these little ups and downs and stuff, and it becomes this whole picture in my head that it's like going to the movies without going to the movies, if that makes any sense.
Wow. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Well, I'm thrilled that you're...
I'll have to interrogate you further on.
I'm thrilled
thank
that
you. It's just great to hear. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. But, growing up...
It's hard to be a writer. You're alone. Mm-hmm. Publishing is changing. it's being consolidated, and your book comes out, and you have things happen, but books have shelf lives, and it's great to know. It's wonderful to hear from people who have read it, and it's even more wonderful for a writer who works in solitude a lot of the time. I mean, it's being a writer is sitting in a chair by yourself day after day in a room, and so when you hear someone who's read your work and thought about it and perceived, and even more so, compared one book to another, you just feel very grateful, and so that's.
Well, for those
something I
people who are
appreciate.
watching this who might want to read one of your books, how would they find one?
Well, Following the Bloom is still in print with Penguin, Tarcher. Giant Bluefin with Farrar, Straus, and Giroux will always be in print, my editor told me. My third book, which was about a boatyard in Maine, run by the son of E.B. White,
Oh,
was a bestseller in some places, the Washington Post.
really?
Yeah. That's still available. It was originally published with Doubleday, and then the paperback was published with Washington Square Press. That's still available. So in the Sugar Season is possibly going to be reissued. The Sugar Season is out of print, and that's because the company was consolidated and then dissolved. So now we're working with a new publisher to reissue it. So that would be harder to find, but I'll send you the book if you want. And so the Hachette Publishing Company now has it, and we're negotiating about a paperback reissue.
Well, I have the copy of the Sugar Season.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Have the Bluefin, and I'm looking forward to the entire book about Sammy Price, because so far it's been fascinating, not only about him, but learning things about you that I was totally unaware of growing up. I mean, you have just this, you said something about me after you watched, I think, The Verdict, something you said I was genetically gifted.
You were genetically gifted.
And I wrote back to you and said, au contraire, basically, the genetically gifted should be directed at you, not me.
And I felt so humbled I couldn't even respond to you. But Todd was the state champion in the 100-yard dash and the fastest runner I'd ever seen. And so...
But you forget to tell everybody you were number one in the javelin throw.
Well, but being first in the 100-yard dash, I mean, that's the premier event.
Well, it's only because it's exciting. I
Yeah,
always
you were
wondered,
gifted genetically. I mean,
how did you, this is the thing that has always not bothered me, but I've always wondered about, because they're spotters in the javelin, because they have to go out and determine how far you threw it.
yeah,
And does anybody ever get hurt?
I think so.
Because it's a spear.
Yeah, it is a spear. And I have heard about people being
Really?
hit by it, but I was fortunately never hit anyone.
Yeah. Thank goodness.
Yeah, it is dangerous. It can be dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and I'm curious too, how did you go about choosing the javelin? Was that something that the coach came up with, said, here, try this?
Oh, no. I wasn't playing a spring sport in my sophomore year. I was sort of just goofy and hanging out, But I was able to throw a ball pretty hard. My cousin Freddie Thatcher was a pitcher. We used to hang out together. We used to go into David Romer's sandpit and throw rocks and stuff. And I had a good throwing arm, like he did. And in gym class, they played that awful game called bombardment.
Yes.
And I picked up the ball and threw it a few times. And the football coach came to me and said, you have a fantastic arm. You should go out for a spring sport. So he told both the baseball coach and the track coach, and I ended up choosing the javelin. Because I used to watch them throwing the javelin, I'd say, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I'd like to do that.
Yeah.
That's how I made it out there. And I happened to be 1 year behind a guy who was state champion before me and threw it farther than I did, but also had a great javelin and a great set of javelin spikes that I used in in the state meet my senior year. So, but we get off track. We digress.
Now, to write a novel, at least in your experience, because I'm sure every novelist or writer who writes a book, it's a little bit different. From the time you come up with the subject matter and say, okay, this is what I want to write about, until it's actually completed to your satisfaction, not necessarily edited, but to your satisfaction before you send it off. How long of a time span can that be?
Usually for me, it was 3 years.
That long?
Yeah. For Giant Bluefin, I went out on tuna boats and on their planes and did research at Woods Hole that lasted 2 years, from 92 to 94. I wrote the draft in 94. That took most of a year.
Wow.
It took 1,400 hours. I actually kept track. And then it was edited. And that's a long process, too. So usually for me, it's 2 years of research and a year of writing. But it can vary.
Do you ever wake up one morning and go, oh, I should write, but I don't feel like it?
Oh, yeah, I do. But then I usually go up there anyway. One of the things I had to do was establish discipline. And I had, my first teacher said, well, not my first teacher, but the teacher who was most important to me said, set a certain time every day to write. He said, I write from 9 to noon, and be religious about it. Go there every day and spend that time writing. And even if you hate it, you don't want to do it. Even if you have to go sit in your desk and stare at the wall, just be there. And eventually it'll become part of your life and a habit. So I did that. You know, just like I learned to tune the piano and play the piano, I started writing from 9 to noon. And then, you know, that varied. Maybe it became 10 to 1 or 2. You mentioned the sugar season. I wrote that book in Bogota, Colombia, while I was on a Fulbright fellowship. I applied for a Fulbright so I could be far away in seclusion. And I taught a single course down there in creative writing. And I spent 6 days a week writing that book. And I would start at 8 or 9 in the morning, go to 3 or 4 in the afternoon. I'd take a break for lunch, and then I'd go sometimes till 5:30. And I wrote 3 drafts when I was down there.
So you must have an incredible encyclopedic memory, or either that or take incredible notes that you can look at, because just remembering the names of the people, the different firms that kind of stole the maple syrup and things like that, because as you say, there was skullduggery in that. Yeah. And just going and walking the lines, which I never knew that's how they did it. I'm from old school where they hang a bucket. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that they went into lines. I mean, it's a fascinating book. So how did you keep all that information fresh in your mind to be able to sit down in Bogota, Colombia, and write it?
Well, I take notes that are really detailed and extensive, and I take them from the time I begin a project till the end. When I went to Bogota, Colombia, I had about 800 pages of single-space notes.
Wow.
The book I'm writing now, I had notes from that time, transcribed. I had lessons that I recorded and transcribed. And I had files that I assembled. I wrote several drafts, and I just didn't feel that I had enough material. And then I discovered that Sammy Price's archives had become available after being 20 years in storage. Wow. I started again. I spent 2 years going down to Harlem to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a part of the New York Public Library. 2 years going down there, making appointments and staying for several days at a time. And that all went into transcriptions. I photographed 1,000 documents of his personal life, letters, contracts, financial records. And then I've spent 4 years writing that book, and I've just finished. So this one involved more work than ever, but I think it's worth it.
Oh my! What I've read so far, it's fantastic.
Thank you.
I mean, it's just. I mean, I really enjoyed Sugar Season, and Sugar Season, to me, is like when you want to relax, you put on your tried and true slippers. That's the way that book
Reads, yeah.
kind of reads in my head. Okay. The giant bluefin, that's more like exciting, hurry up and wait, exciting, hurry up and wait. And I'm a pilot, so I love the fish spotting and talking about that. And Sammy Price, it's like it is the dual subject matter. It's you and Sammy and your interaction with him. And then around that is all the history of blues piano with all these other people mentioning and piano tuning. So I am so looking forward to the finished, published book. But I have a question. What's the next book going to be about?
Oh, gee, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. And I really haven't been looking. And I'm kind of looking forward to that time when I'm open to anything.
Right.
And I think that's the way it's been with almost all of them. I have a friend who, would plan 5 novels ahead, but I don't do that. Although, I have at times said, when I finish this book about giant bluefin, or when I finish this book about this boatyard, I'm going to work on the Sammy Price book again. And I did that a few times. But I needed more material. And maybe I needed time to reflect. I thought back then at times, this might be a book for later in life. And when I discovered the archives that were available, that there were 10 boxes packed with hundreds and hundreds of documents, I decided to retire from teaching so that I could write full time. Wow. I had always wanted to do that, but life's demands. And teaching often goes in tandem with writing. Mm-hmm. And so, so this time I was able to write full time. And I deliberately did not seek a contract. I had contracts and advances from my other books because I didn't want a deadline. Right. I came up against deadlines a few times and I felt I just wasn't ready to finish. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I would do an afterword on a book when it was in the process of editing. I did that with the book about the boatyard because the man I was writing about was dying from cancer at the time. And when I left, he hadn't died. But when I went back for the launching of the boat I was writing about, he had died. So there was a lot I had to revisit. This time, I made sure to be somewhere where I could write in Bogota, and I didn't have a contract. I'm sorry, no. That was the sugar season. Yeah. Sorry, I'm getting them mixed up. That was what I did that time. This time I retired and spent just as much time as I could and got just as much material as I could and went back and did interviews with people from his family and got the material I wanted. To put this book where I wanted it to be, because I felt that this book was kind of the book of covering almost my whole career. In 1982, when I went to see him for the first time, I was a graduate student. And when I finished, I was teaching at UMass. I was a lecturer. So it's really covered my whole career. Working with this man, knowing this man, studying with him, thinking about his music, and then learning more about his life. And so it's traveled with me throughout my whole career as a writer. And now, will it be the finish of my career? I don't know. Writing books is exhausting. And when I usually finish a book, I am exhausted. When I was in Bogota, and when I was writing the acknowledgments for that book after 3 drafts, I collapsed in the street. Really? I went out on a Friday afternoon to a bakery, and on the way home I started to get lightheaded, and then I started to panic because I got really lightheaded, and I crashed into a wall and went headfirst into an intersection, a busy intersection, and then I woke up, and there was an ambulance there, and there was someone next to me and said, "We're going to put you in the ambulance." And they put me in the ambulance, and I was looking out at the intersection, and then I happened to glance out the side door, and there were 6 of my students from my class at the university who had been out watching a soccer game. Colombia was playing Argentina, and she had gone through my recent calls and called these students and told them where I was. And they took taxis. There were taxis all over Bogota, these little yellow taxis. And they came and walked with me to the hospital. And I was okay. They didn't find anything. I might have had a concussion. But that's all to say that writing books makes you tired sometimes, and maybe a little lightheaded, but
it's fun.
It's still worth it.
Yeah.
When it comes out right, and when you feel you've done it right, there is really, I won't say there's no feeling like it, because there are other different kind of feelings that are wonderful, but it is a great, great feeling, even to write an essay, or a chapter, or whatever, to finish a book, and it's just a fantastic feeling. So
how do people find? Whoops, knocking your microphone out of the way.
Yeah.
How do people find you? What's your website?
My website is douglaswhynott.com.
And how do you spell Whynott?
Whynott. And my books are on Amazon. They can be found there, or other places.
Well, this has been fantastic. Can you play like 30, 45 seconds of some boogie-woogie blues for us?
Sure. I'll play this thing.
And while he's playing that, we're going to say goodbye to you folks. Thanks for watching. Check out my friend Douglas Whynott. I know him as Doug. Our track coach used to call him Dougie Whynott. But he's a fantastic, really multi-leveled person. Who knew? It's been so much fun getting to know him better. And away we go with some blues piano. Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a wrap.
Good. That was great. Thank you. We got more into my books than we did in music, but we covered it all.
We did. It was good.
Okay.